Welcome to chapter 18, our final chapter. So at this point, you have made it almost all the way through Biology 100, so good job. All right, so chapter 18, we're continuing with our discussion of biodiversity, ecosystems, and this time we're going to talk a bit about conservation. So I think that the chapter 18 topics are probably the most important. My particular favorite topics are actually genetics, but I think that as far as learning about biology, learning why biology is important, and sort of ending with all of our reasons for studying all of this stuff for the rest of the semester, I think chapter 18 is the most important because conservation of biodiversity and our planet's resources is critically important for the survival of the human population and the agriculture, the animals, all of the things that help support the human population. So that's a very human-centric view. There are other important organisms on Earth, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for conserving those other organisms, even if they may not have a particularly direct impact on your life. So in chapter 17, we ended with population growth, and I think that that's a nice segue into chapter 18 because since population growth is so high, there is a carrying capacity to planet Earth, not only for the human population, but all of the plants and animals that live on it. There's only so many resources that go around. And as the human population continues to use those resources are not available to later generations, and they're not available to other organisms. And they're even not available to some other people on our planet. So as humans continue to use and rely on Earth's natural resources, it's critically important that we keep conservation and maintaining biodiversity sort of at the forefront of debate and efforts and policy. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is just a measure of the variety of things on Earth. Of the variety, how much variability there is within a particular species. So this might be variability at the genetic level, it might be variability at the phenotypic level, and it's variability at the ecosystem level. So the higher the biodiversity in a particular area, generally the healthier that area is. The more productivity it has, the more organisms it can support. So if we think of biodiversity on Earth in a global scale, the more biodiversity we have, the healthier our planet is going to be in order to support our human population. And if we don't keep that biodiversity in mind when we're managing things like agriculture and housing and deforestation and things like that, we're going to end up sickening the planet, and it's not going to be able to maintain its overall health and maintain the human population. So biodiversity is important for a few reasons. One, ecosystem health that I just mentioned. Two is sustainability, to be able to sustain the human population for long periods of time. Because even if we have a carrying capacity on Earth, the Earth still needs to be able to maintain the human population at that carrying capacity. And then biodiversity is important for something called ecosystem services. So these are all the things that the environment sort of quote unquote does for us. The environment filters our water, it gives us nutrients, it produces oxygen, it takes carbon dioxide out of the air. The larger global environment maintains temperature variations and limits temperature variations, maintains a constant temperature on Earth. So these are services that the Earth is actually providing for us that are required for us to live here. And ecosystem services are at their highest when biodiversity is high. So coming from a completely human-centric view, biodiversity has a huge value to humans. Our book uses a couple of really interesting examples of just some of the ways that biodiversity is important. And the importance of this biodiversity is sort of a way to look at why things that you maybe don't care about are still important. So is it really important to conserve a specific resource? Maybe you don't use Taxol, this particular drug here, but is it important to conserve the tree that it comes from? And why is it important? Why should you care about a rainforest that is thousands of miles away? Why do you care if some of it gets cut down? Well, because as I said, a diverse planet is a healthy planet. And the more diversity we have, the more resources that humans have to tap into. So there are a lot of medically important compounds that can be found all over the place. This example here, Taxol, is an anti-cancer drug. So obviously this is important if you're undergoing cancer treatment because it interferes with cell division. And if you remember from earlier chapters, cancer is uncontrolled cell division. And even though this is just one example, our book gives a few more examples of specific drugs that we can get from the environment. It shows why biodiversity is so important. This particular tree is called the Pacific yew, Y-E-W, and it's found in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And someone discovered that this particular chemical, which is a toxin in the plant, they don't really know what it does. They think it's a toxin. They don't really know what it does in the plant, but they found that it's effective against cancer. And if you have a variety of organisms from which to draw things like this, you have a better chance of being able to use some of these services that the environment can provide. Another example of value to humans is bacteria. If you look at section 8.2, it's this is how we do it section. It talks about bacteria that can break down carbon sources, so oil spills, methane spills, and basically clean up the environment for us. So it's a way for the environment to clean up our mess. The example for this is a spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and they couldn't figure out why this particular spill, when this oil rig exploded, it released a lot of oil, but it also released a lot of methane. And they found that the methane disappeared, and they realized that it was because there were bacteria that were already present in this ecosystem, were able to break it down and get rid of it for us. So these are just a couple of ways that we benefit from having a diverse environment. So there are a couple of ways that the incredible amount of biodiversity is important to humans. One is what we call intrinsic value. So this is a value that something has just in itself. We aren't giving it a value, but things that have value just because of what they are. So even though they're not important to us, the environment is important to other organisms. So the communities and the ecosystems that are being formed by these organisms is important for the life there, even if it doesn't really matter to us particularly. It's important because it's any particular aspect of an environment is going to support everything around it. And then we have the extrinsic value, or the utility value for us. What can we get from it? And so these ecosystem services with this value to humans fall into 4 categories. Provisioning services. These are things that we get to use, products that are useful from nature. Food, medicine, fresh water. The environment is providing all of these things for us. And so by managing the diversity within a particular ecosystem, we're allowing these things to continue. We're allowing a food supply to continue and fresh water supply. Habitat services. Now these may or may not directly affect us, but these are the ways that environments provide habitats to other organisms. Now this is sort of a roundabout way to get to human value, but if the ecosystem is maintaining biodiversity and maintaining genetic diversity, then there's a chance that in the future we're going to find a use for it. Another one of these ecosystem services is regulating surfaces. So I like to think of this as the sort of cleanup crew. This is the part of the environment that provides us with clean water, clean air, maintains soil health, breaks down carbon and sort of performs the carbon cycle. Pollination of organisms, because if we aren't having organisms pollinate our crops, we're not getting those provisioning services. And then there's sort of the more abstract ideas, the cultural services. So these are the ways that the environment kind of gives us a healthy lifestyle. We can go out into particular environments and enjoy them. We can relax, we can visit them, we can spend time in nature with our families for mental health reasons, for physical health reasons. I'm sure all of you have a particular place, a particular type of environment that feels like home to you, that makes you happy when you're there. And maybe it's a park, maybe it's your front porch. My particular happy place is the mountains in the West. So everybody has these places where they can go and they can enjoy the environment. And if we're not preserving that, if we're not maintaining these services and maintaining these systems, then all of these different types of services, whether they're cultural or not, are going to go away. So in order to preserve all of these services, we have to think about conservation. So conservation biology is just addressing the way that we look at an environment, understanding the interactions of all the parts, and evaluating how we can most efficiently preserve the resources in a particular area or even on Earth. So the concept of conservation biology often factors in things like economics, psychology, political science. Who needs the resources? How much do they need? And even thinking about what issues we have already caused and how we can better use them, the particular resources in an environment in the future. Now, at some point, conservation has to kind of reach the political level, because if people aren't going to follow the concept or follow the ideals of conservation, it's going to have to be mandated. And so we end up bringing in a political factor, a legal factor as well. And all of those things go into conservation biology and evaluating what needs to be protected and the best way to go about it. Before you can start protecting things, you need to know where the things are that you're going to protect. And often the focus of conservation is in biodiversity hotspots. These are places where biodiversity is really high. Now, identifying those is part of conservation biology, and there are people whose job it is to sort of identify what needs to be protected and how. But in general, where do we find the greatest biodiversity? Well, in general, the greatest biodiversity is going to be around the equator. And then as we move away from the equator, as we get to higher and higher latitudes, biodiversity is going to decrease. So if you think about what is happening at the equator, we have our tropical rainforest, huge biodiversity. And as we move away in either direction towards the poles, that biodiversity decreases until you get to the poles where the biodiversity is really low. Now, thinking back to our discussion on weather patterns and where we get our particular biomes, this is related, the biodiversity hotspots are related to solar energy. Now remember, solar energy is greatest around the equator, which is why we have those biodiversity hotspots. So now let's go back to chapter 17. When you have a higher amount of sunlight, available, you get an increase in primary producers, so our lowest level of the food chain. So more sunlight means more producers, which means there are more species that can be supported in that particular environment. A higher total number of individuals, a higher amount of diversity in that particular area. So as you increase primary production, you also increase the biodiversity and the health of that environment. Two other factors that influence biodiversity. One is the evolutionary history of the area. So this basically means that the longer an area has gone undisturbed, the more diversity that has been there. Or the longer that environment has been proceeding, even without a disturbance, the more diversity is going to be in that area. And this goes back to that idea in chapter 17 of succession. So if we're thinking about a major climatic event that drastically changes the environment, as the farther we get from that event, the more diversification we're going to have, the more time there is for evolution and natural selection to occur to get to a level of species richness and biodiversity. And then last, we have the rate of disturbance. So if you recall again from our discussion of succession in chapter 17, in areas of disturbance, we see the ability of that area to respond better. And that's because when you have the right amount of disturbance for the particular area that you're in, you're going to wipe out some of the species that are the best competitors. And when you do that, you allow the other ones to increase in abundance and to be better competitors. If disturbance happens too much, those populations are never going to rebound. And if it doesn't happen enough, then the species that are the best competitors are going to compete out everybody. So each habitat is different, and each type of disturbance that is appropriate is going to be different. But depending on what is best for that environment, it's usually a sort of an intermediate rate of disturbance that allows for the highest amount of biodiversity. So some of the major places that we find the greatest biodiversity are called biodiversity hotspots. Now these are places where biodiversity is really high, and you'll notice when you look at this map that these are most closely centered around the equator. So we've got our rainforests here right along the equator. We see some a little farther north and south, and that's okay, because these particular environments are local environments that are really good for biodiversity. Now I put this California floristic province picture up here because, well, California, that's where I'm from. But biodiversity hotspots are important because they make up less than 1% of the world's area, but have 20% or more of the world's species there. And so it's really important to focus the attention of conservation on these areas, because in losing these areas, we're going to be losing the greatest number of species. I'm not going to spend too much time on the individual environments. I'm just going to briefly tell you why these environments are reservoirs of biodiversity. I've kind of already talked about tropical rainforests. They're located around the equator, a lot of sunshine, a lot of primary production, and therefore a lot of biodiversity. Islands are important because even though they're small, they often have a lot of unique species, or what we call endemic species, those species that are only found in particular locations. And this is because islands are often isolated. If you remember from our discussion of evolution, islands are a really good place for biodiversity because they offer unique environments for organisms that come there, and then they can undergo their own selection to adapt to the environments in which they're in. but they're important for biodiversity because they're small, and being small limits their population size. And as we'll see in just a minute, when you have a small population size, you're more likely to lose the individuals in some sort of catastrophic or even minor event. And so islands are important places to focus attention because of the potential for loss of those small populations. And then we have coral reefs. So coral reefs occur in ocean areas with low levels of nutrients, but they're important because they provide habitats for and protection for small animals and plants and things like that. And that draws other organisms, other trophic levels in. And then our book also goes into deep ocean. It's not on this picture. Deep oceans were thought to be basically lifeless, but more recent studies show that they actually have a lot of biodiversity in deep oceans. And so deep oceans are not well studied. It's hard to study deep ocean environments. But in the future, looking at conserving some of those environments because of their biodiversity is going to be very important. So thinking about these biodiversity hotspots and the potential for extinction in those areas, our book goes into a short review of extinctions. We talked about extinction in chapter 12, I believe. So just as a quick review, there are two types of extinctions. One is mass extinction, where a large number of species become extinct over a short period of time. Now, mass extinction is usually due to some sort of sudden environmental change. So think this one here on the right, the asteroid that hit the planet and wiped out the dinosaurs. Usually, mass extinctions are categorized by a time frame of less than 2 million years, but they're sometimes even shorter. When that asteroid struck 65 million years ago, about 75% of all species were wiped out. And remember, this one was important because it wiped out the dinosaurs and it opened up the environment for mammals. So those small mammals that were able to survive were able to diversify. And then we have background extinction. Background extinctions are extinctions that are sort of the low-level normal rate that occur all the time. Now, these are not necessarily due to some sort of sudden environmental change. They're more due to the biology or the genetic makeup of the particular individual species, and whether or not that species can adapt to local changes. So on average, species persist for about 10 million years before they go extinct, but there's a huge variety in that. So there are a few factors that influence the risk for background extinction. Now, I'm not talking about mass extinction, I'm not talking about asteroids or an ice age or anything like that. I'm talking about local extinction. Now, this might be an extinction of a particular population, or it might be an extinction of a species that's in a local area. If the geographic range is small, this is going to cause problems for the organism, because if the range that this species is adapted to is too small, then that species is not going to have anywhere else to go. They cannot expand their range. And so that means that if resources become limited or a change occurs and they're no longer adapted to their environment, there's nowhere to go to find a slightly different environment or more resources. So if you have a restricted geographic range, you're going to have much more trouble responding to limited resources and things like that. If you are an organism that has an extensive range, so instead of being limited to one little island here, you can expand into pretty much all of Polynesia, Southern Asia, and Australia, then you're going to have much better time finding an environment that fits for you and adapting into that new environment. The next thing that influences background extinction is the size of the population. Remember when we were talking about the Hardy-Weinberg equation, and we were talking about microevolution and changes in population, and one of the factors that causes evolution in a population is genetic drift. And one of the things we said about genetic drift is that if a population is small, they're going to be more greatly affected by chance events. So if you have a really small population, if you're a population of 2 frogs and a large animal comes by and steps on you, well, that's the end. But if you're a large population and someone comes by and steps on 2 of you, it's not a big deal because there's a large population surrounding you. And so small populations are at a greater risk of extinction. The other problem with small populations is that they have low genetic diversity. And remember, this can be related to the bottleneck effect, where you have a reduction in population size and the genetic makeup of that population is different after that event. If you don't have, or if you have limited genetic diversity, then there's going to be less genetic diversity available for natural selection to work. And so the traits that are present within the population are also going to determine whether or not that population can respond to a particular event. And when they're small, they're likely to have less diversity. And then finally, we have habitat tolerance. Now, this is sort of similar to geographic range. It's the same idea. If your niche sort of dials you into a particular habitat and that's the only one that works for you, then you're going to have a problem. You cannot expand. If your environment is so specific that there's not much of it and you can't expand because you can't tolerate other places, then you're going to have a problem and you're probably going to have issues with local extinction. So our book uses a couple of examples. I should have done them with the topic, but that's okay. As an example of limited geographical range, we have the Tasmanian devil. So the Tasmanian devil was a marsupial about the size of a dog and is only found on this little island here, Tasmania. And they are vulnerable because they have nowhere else to go. They're found nowhere else in the world. And so if they cannot find new habitats within this area and they have nowhere to go, then they are more likely to become extinct. If they had a larger range, then they would be less likely to become extinct. Population size, the example our book uses is tigers. So they have a small population size, and when you have a small population size, you're at greater risk. It's harder to find mates. It's a smaller genetic pool from which to draw from. Habitat tolerance example that our book gives is the passenger pigeon. Those guys are now extinct. They had a very small range of forest type that they could make their nests in. And then as part of their sort of social structure and breeding structure, they needed a large number of individuals to be successful. So once their habitat began to be encroached upon, then that pigeon died out. So why is all of this extinction important? Well, the reason it's important is because we are in the midst of a mass extinction. Now, you might think, oh, global warming. Maybe. That's only a small part of it. Remember, mass extinctions are often categorized by major environmental changes, but global warming is only one small part of this mass extinction event. This mass extinction event is important because it's caused by a particular species, and that particular species is humans. we have been causing changes, drastic changes to the environment for a long period of time. And some of that we are beginning to see the effects of, things like global warming and lack of certain resources and things like that. But this one is important because we're causing it. It could have been possibly preventable. Who knows? Maybe, you know, hindsight is 2020. Maybe we couldn't have prevented it. But humans are causing an unprecedented amount of extinction. Background extinction rates are usually about 1 extinction per million species per year. But current numbers estimate that the rate of extinction is about 1,000 times higher than that. Well, that's hard to estimate because we don't really know how many species are actually on Earth. But we do know that the rate at which organisms are going extinct is quite alarming. So humans cause extinction. Humans are causing this mass extinction in a variety of ways. And the largest way is habitat loss and environmental degradation. So when people begin to use the environment for other purposes, this causes loss of habitat and decreased health of the environment. Now, this is often due to urban development spreading out from cities into other areas, reclaiming land that was once natural and making it part of urbanization and development. And then using land for agriculture. So it's not just living, but it's growing the things that we eat. The largest place for habitat loss and degradation is in the rainforest. And this is a problem because that's also one of our biodiversity hotspots. And we'll talk a little bit later in the lecture about why the rainforest is so important. And it's not just that it's a biodiversity hotspot, but individuals are moving into the rainforest. They are cutting it down at an alarming rate, and they're using it for agriculture and development. A couple other reasons that are ways that humans are causing mass extinctions are unsustainable resource allocation, so logging too much in the Pacific Northwest, overfishing our fisheries, things like that. And then, of course, just consuming organisms. The bonobo is an ape that's very similar to chimpanzees. It's kind of a cousin to chimpanzees. And over exploitation, using that animal for food has driven it almost to extinction. So there are a lot of ways that human activity is impacting this extinction rate. Another important thing that's happening that's kind of goes along with habitat loss is fragmentation. So even if we only take a small part of a particular area, we are often isolating populations from one another that normally had connections. So you might build a road that those animals cannot cross now, and you've fragmented their habitat. You've limited resources for those particular organisms.